I'd like to thank Patricia for helping set this up, and also for Tamsin, who behind the scenes is helping with the technology and making sure that the slides advance. I'm sitting in rural Victoria. I live about an hour and a half out of Melbourne in a very small rural community. It's winter here, and I wish I was in Krakow or somewhere else that's slightly warmer. But it's lovely that people have joined this session, and I welcome if there's any questions as we go. If somehow people can ask questions later as well, maybe through Tamsin's help. I'd like to just start by acknowledging, and we'll go on to the next slide, thanks. Just advance to the next slide.
Sorry, just a moment, it wasn't working enough.
Here in Australia, it's traditional to acknowledge our First Nations traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting. Djadjawurrung people lived where I'm sitting. They're one of 250 First Nations peoples in Australia. And in recent years, we've come to appropriately acknowledge that they are the traditional owners of this land. And I acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to thank Common Ground Research Networks for publishing both my 2015 and 2021 Men Shed books. My 2021 book is called Shoulder to Shoulder, and it's now 15 years since Australian Men Sheds Association first conference in 2007, where I first spoke about men being shoulder to shoulder in sheds. And I'll come to that later. But there's now around 2,900 shed-based organisations open around the world, which is quite incredible given that really the movement's only 25 years old. But I also acknowledge that COVID in the past 2 years has significantly challenged men's sheds and communities globally. And because a lot of older men come to sheds and participate, men have been less likely to participate because of COVID, and some sheds have been severely impacted as a consequence. So I'm just acknowledging that on the front end. So I'd like to go to the next slide and just talk about my intentions today. I'd just like to give some idea of where the men's shed movement gained traction. I'd like to talk about why I actually wrote a new book, given I wrote one in 2015. Also identify what it is about the model that works, particularly for older men and women, and also introduce a new movement that some of you may have heard about, which is the Women's Shed movement. And finally, I'll tease out some important implications of research about sheds associated with working with men and women in community contexts. And given that many of the people in this network are interested in older adults, really try and tie down what it is about men's sheds that works in older people in communities. So let's go to where men's sheds are globally. The next slide, please. This is the picture around 6 months ago. There's around 1,300 sheds open around Australia. The number in brackets after each of the numbers is the number of sheds per million people. So if you look at the top line, there's 1,306 sheds in Australia. That represents around 51 men's sheds per million people in Australia. And you can see the growth since 2015 is around 43%. If you look at the next slide, you'll see there's while there's less sheds in Ireland, no, go back to the previous slide, please. You'll see that there's 83 sheds per million people. So there's actually more sheds per population in Ireland than anywhere else in the world. And that growth has been significant. But you'll also see there's around 800 sheds in the UK. There's 120 in New Zealand. There's a growing number in Canada, Denmark, the US, Canada, and you can see there's a couple also in Iceland. But I also acknowledge that this is only the registered sheds, those registered with state or national associations. There's many sheds which are operating below the radar, particularly in aged and residential care settings where people participate in these communities of men's practice or shed practice out the back of an aged care centre. And these are places that aren't necessarily accessible to the wider population. Next slide, please. So in addition to the men's sheds, there's a new movement which started around 10 years ago. And up to 2021, there was around 60 of these in Australia and around 30 in Ireland and the UK and a small number in New Zealand. So this is many less than the men's sheds, but it is a significant increase since 2015, albeit on a very small base. But it gives you some idea how the movement has moved. So if I go back to the start, and we'll go to the next slide, please. So how on earth did this thing start? If we go back around 29, 30 years ago, there was a woman working in an aged care setting in South Australia, and she was doing programs with women in the aged care centre. And she noticed, this lady, Maxine Kitto, noticed that the vast majority of community and health workers were women. But more interestingly, she noticed when she was doing these programs for women in this community health context for older people, she noticed that the women who were accessing the services in her program were actually healthier than the men waiting outside in their cars to pick up their wives in the program. But she also noticed that her father's shed was really important to him in his later life. It was where he continued his role as the handyman, the fixer, the craftsman, and where he goes to get away from it all. So this was something that she noticed, and she ended up setting the first shed up ever anywhere in the world in 1993. So if we jump ahead 5 years to 1998, next slide, please. There was a men's shed started, the very first one in the world, started in Tongala in Victoria. And I documented how this started in my first book in 2015. And Dick McGowan, who started this shed, was he was himself depressed. He'd had an undiagnosed heart attack. He had diabetes, and he was out of work. He was retrenched as a secondary, as a primary school principal. And he realised that creating a space for men to go somewhere, in his words, he said, we all need somewhere to go, something to do, and someone to talk with. And he said, we need to have somewhere to go to build the daily achievements of companionship, a feeling of worth, physical activity, a pride of accomplishment. And so this was really this was the aha moment from this gentleman called Dick McGowan just 25 years ago. So if we jump right forward to the present, next slide, please. This is an insight that comes out of a PhD, which was done by in Queensland, Australia, by a female academic, Deb Mulligan, and her thesis was about the marginalisation of older men. And she concluded, after looking at men's sheds in her study, that there was a number of things about men's sheds that ticked the following boxes. It created, as you can see on the slide, an all-male environment that's both non-confrontational and welcoming. It created a democratic grassroots organisation where a lifetime of knowledge and skills is actually appreciated and shared. She also realised, and this comes straight out of her PhD, that the men's shed creates a community that values wisdom inherent in ageing and doesn't pathologise or negatively stereotype older men. And so it's an opportunity to connect with a community where men can be of service. So these were what she saw were the key attributes. These were the boxes that men's sheds tended to tick in terms of men's needs. But she went further than this in the next slide. And this is again from her PhD. She said, it's not just what men need. We need to create an accompanying organisational ethos and structure which ticks a number of boxes. And the first four of the boxes on your screen, which are in point form, come straight from her thesis. The fifth one I've added. She says, the organisation needs to have a male-only culture where it celebrates masculinity and provides a space for men. It needs a grassroots focus where it emphasises equality. It needs to take an anti-deficit position, ignoring stereotypes of ageing and older men generally. It also is about creating an organisation which is about community capacity building, where it provides opportunities for its members to share the wisdom with the community. And I've added this fourth one. And for those of you who don't know what salutogenic is about keeping people healthy. So it's about providing a setting in which men, older men, are provided with a supportive environment which basically accommodates their health and well-being. So this is the theory that sits behind the men's shed. So let's go on to what's in my most recent book. Next slide, please. These are the reasons why I wrote a new book. I actually contacted Common Ground Publishing during the COVID pandemic, and I said, why don't I revise my 2015 book? But after conversation with Common Ground, they convinced me that there was enough had happened to create a brand new book, which included a new chapter about women's sheds, a new chapter about men's sheds in Canada, a new chapter about men's sheds in the US, and also a separate standalone chapter about women's sheds, because all of these things had happened since my first book in 2015. But these are the reasons why, these are the 7 reasons why I called my 2021 book Broadening Shed Reach. The first reason is that while men's sheds have been broadly attractive to mainly older, white, rural, conservative, Anglophone men, there's no reason why they can't reach younger men. There's no reason why they can't reach men of colour, including First Nations men. There's no reason why they can't reach people in cities. There's no reason why they can't reach men from non-English speaking backgrounds, and also more gender diverse people. The other reason is that it's not just about what it does for the men, it's about broadening the reach to acknowledge that the value is not just to men, it's to the communities. including, as that third point says, about improving the lives of women and children. There's three contexts, non-Anglophone contexts, in which sheds have actually started. There's around 30 to 40 sheds now open in Denmark. There's 4 in Iceland, and there's around a dozen which have opened in Kenya. And they show that it will work beyond English-speaking contexts. The other reason I wrote it is because it hasn't all been smooth sailing. Sometimes peak bodies have been created. For example, here in Australia, we've got state shed associations and national shed associations, and they haven't always been on the same page. And my argument is we need to avoid conflict, duplication, and broaden the reach of peak bodies to avoid these conflicts. The other important reason for talking about broadening is that I think there is scope for a women's shed movement, either separate from men's sheds or operating in conjunction with men's sheds. But the other reason, and the final reason about broadening shed reach, is to acknowledge that men's sheds in person were very successful, but since COVID, there's a number of ways of providing services and programs, including through Shed Online, through Shed Radio, through doing shed activity in nature, as they've done very successfully in Denmark. So I'm just acknowledging that COVID's actually broadened the range of what's possible. Let's go to the next slide. And this is really just a mud map, a broad picture of what's in my Shoulder to Shoulder book. There's a first chapter basically sets the scene, particularly for people who haven't read my first book. And then it talks about men's sheds in Australia, in the UK, in Ireland, New Zealand, the US, Canada, Denmark, elsewhere in the world. And then there's a standalone chapter on women's sheds. There's a standalone chapter about the men's shed research evidence, and you'll see that 5 of those chapters have highlighted in yellow have actually got other contributing authors. And then I try and pull it all together into a final chapter, which is a manifesto really for broadening the men's shed movement. I also stress that my new book, which is quite a big one, there's I think, my new book is 444 pages, and it includes an index which covers both books, because there was no index in my first book. So it helps you find stuff a little bit easier. So next slide. Each national chapter looks at how sheds have developed. So let's take the US, for example. So the US chapter talks about sheds in the US. It talks about where the sheds are in the US, stretching from Hawaii to Florida. It teases out how the men's sheds are organised and networked nationally. For example, in the US, it's the US Men's Shed Association. And then it introduces new case studies. There's actually a total of 56 new case studies in my book. And it also looks at how COVID has affected sheds and how COVID has responded. And then there's an opportunity in the end of each national chapter to talk about where all this might be heading. So to summarise, I've got a table in the next slide, which shows you basically what's in the book. For example, if we look at Australia, there's 36 men's sheds which I've revisited in my new book. I've gone back to all the sheds that I visited in my first book and looked at what's happened right up to 2021. But there's also, as you can see in the first line, 20 new men's shed case studies. And I've chosen case studies which illustrate the theme of broadening. But you'll also see in that first line that there's actually case studies, 3 new case studies about women's sheds. And so there's there's some really rich and interesting stories, not just about broad brush about what's happening in Australia, but you can actually dive in and look at individual sheds. You can see how they work, who they work for. And I've co-created these case studies with the assistance of people around the world. And I acknowledge the huge generous assistance I've had from men's sheds and women's sheds all around the world in writing this book, because you can see there's 131 total case studies covered in my new book, which is a rich source of data. And I've put in the stories because all sheds are different. There's no right way. And so what I've done is emphasise that sheds can adapt to wherever they're set up, to the communities in which they're embedded. Where I'm sitting, there's a shed just 10 kilometres away, and it's very different from another shed that's 20 kilometres in the other direction. And there's another shed down the hill 30 kilometres away that's different again. And they're all modelled and adapted. They're grassroots. And what they do, how they're set up, how they work, whether women are involved or not, is decided at the level of community. It's not like McDonald's. It's not like an international chain. It's a loosely networked body of sheds, which have developed pretty organically. So if we go and look at the next slide, you'll see where they started, and this gives you some idea of how they started. The first shed, called The Shed in Australia, was created in 1993. The first men's shed was created here in Victoria in 1998. That's just 24 years ago. Sheds spread to New Zealand a decade later. That's just by 2008. So they've only been going in New Zealand for less than 15 years. Similarly in Canada, they started there about 15 years ago. They started in 2009 in Ireland. Then the first women's shed started here in Australia in 2010. And then they started, as you can see, in England, Canada, Scotland and Wales, and they've really, really grown faster than anywhere else in the world in England, Scotland and Wales. They've just been so popular, and in every small town in Scotland, Wales and England, there is now a men's shed. It's been highly successful, and while it started reasonably recently in the US, I predict that if it takes off as I predict, there'll be a lot of men's sheds also in the US down the track. So next slide. It's hard to sort of summarise everything in a big book, but I'll just give you what I think are the big picture conclusions. Sheds are expanding and they're making huge and positive differences, not only to the men who are involved, but also to families and communities in very diverse settings in at least 15 countries worldwide. The movement's broadening, it's changing, and it's adapting to new cultural and national contexts. And this is natural and normal. There's no right way of doing it. The way they do sheds in Denmark is different from the way they do it in Ireland. The other conclusion that I've come to based on the evidence is that COVID has severely affected most sheds, which really do need time and resources to recover, because many men, particularly older men, are less likely and very much more reluctant to come out into a community space doing stuff shoulder to shoulder. There's a manifesto in my book based on the evidence that it's important that men's shed become more inclusive and more diverse men. And I mean more diverse men in terms of cultural, linguistic, racial, and gender backgrounds. I think there's a case for broadening the scope of Men's Shed's organisation. I think it's important to keep researching about impact, because it's important to know whether this is working or not. I think it's important also to encourage and support women's sheds, including in relation to men's sheds. And some men's sheds have transformed themselves, for example, to have a men's shed 2 days a week and have a women's shed 2 days a week. Why not? It's using the same resource for the same purpose. It's people, men and women, doing stuff shoulder to shoulder together in a community of practice, with huge benefits to the community, huge benefits to the participants. And it's important to understand how and why the model works. And don't go on to the next slide yet, but it's about boosting self-efficacy, self-determination and self-esteem, which I'll show in a later slide. And I think there's an argument in my book that there's many creative ways of making sheds more inclusive and sustainable, including more women and older people, and also broadening the shed reach. So let's look at the next slide. I'm sitting here in Australia. We've taken a lot of movements from around the world. Here in Australia, we adopted the Mechanics Institute movement from Scotland, which was absolutely huge here in Australia during the gold rush days of the 1860s, 1870s. But those Mechanics Institutes largely died. But there's some similarities between the Mechanics Institute movement that started in Scotland, which was basically about men, working class men, doing stuff for themselves and self-organising. There was also the Workers' Educational Association movement, which came out of Scotland and also came to Australia and shone brightly here in Australia. We've taken up other movements. For example, we now in Australia, our young children go to kindergarten, and as many people will know, the kindergarten model came out of Germany in the 1830s, came to Australia in 1895, and now it's an Australian and global movement. Similarly, Rotary, Lions, Probus started in the US, and Lions and Probus in the UK. They spread to Australia in the 1920s, 1940s, 1960s. Some of you may be aware that U3A has been very successful around the world, starting in France in 1973, coming to Australia in 1984 and spreading also to many Anglophone countries, Malta, the UK, many parts in Europe. U3A has been very successful. So my point is that men's sheds, which started in Australia, are Australia's gift back to the world. We gave it to Ireland in 2007. We gave it to the UK and New Zealand in 2009. And it's now Australia's gift to the world. Canada, Denmark, the US, whoever else wants to pick it up. And I predict that many other countries, once they understand the model, it will be successful and it will transfer. And the reason it works is because men are not customers, clients, or patients. They're not students. They are participants in an activity. This is why it works. And this is also why women's sheds have been successful. And so I think that this is a movement that will be successful and given back to the world. So in the next slide, I'd just like to step back from all of this and talk about older people. Here in Australia, we know that literacy, this is functional literacy, including health literacy, falls away with age. So here in Australia, we know that 50% of men aged 50 are functionally illiterate. and we know it's age 70, it's 70% of men in Australia are functionally illiterate. Then we stop surveying. So my question is, why aren't we focusing on finding ways of reaching people with low functional literacy in later life? We also acknowledge that internet connectivity and skills and IT literacy skills are much lower in old, rural and lower socioeconomic status and men, and yet governments are putting everything online. And so I'm also acknowledging that the service provision of health and family and aged care services is very highly female gendered. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have women in these sectors. I'm just asking the question, where are the men? And are we paying enough money to the workers in these sectors to get a more broad and diverse range of workers, including men and women, in health and family and aged care services? Because at the moment, if you walk into an aged care centre, almost everybody will be a woman. And the research shows that such services don't necessarily meet older men's needs. And as a consequence, many men feel disempowered as a consequence. And my strong point, if you remember nothing else from my chat today, is that it's important not to disempower people by calling them customers, clients, or patients. It's okay to do this in our professional communities, but to call people clients is just so disempowering and demeaning. And I think we just got to find other ways of describing older people. I'll return now in the next slide to Deb Mulligan's PhD thesis, where she created what she calls her clustered contributive needs of older men. And she said older men need all of these things. They need to be able to share wisdom and belong in that first segment. They need to feel worthy, feel connected, feel wanted, and feel valued at any age. And despite age, older men want to be independent, they want to be autonomous, they want to be useful, and they want to be of service. But I would actually argue, and if we go to the next slide, please, although Deb Mulligan's thesis talks about older men, I can't see why we can't just drop the term older and talk about the needs of all people, men and women, young and old. I think we all need to be able to share wisdom and belong at any age. We all need self-esteem. We all need to feel worthy and connected and wanted and valued. And we all want at any age, whether we're men or women, young or old, to be able to self-determine, to be independent, to be autonomous, to be useful and of service. So the things that men's sheds do is not rocket science. It's just about basically, for me, it's just basic human needs. So I see that we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. I'll go to the next slide and I'll just finish there and I'll open it up to questions. So there's opportunities to build a movement, which is why I wrote the book. There's opportunities to connect older men and women. There's opportunities to do better stuff, including based on the models of how men's sheds work in aged care and residential settings. There's some really good examples here in Australia of where sheds have been set up for older people with dementia, with disability and post-traumatic syndrome. I think there are opportunities to encourage women's sheds. I think there's opportunities to keep older people connected and well. And finally, I think it's important that we ensure that the wisdom of older generations is shared and passed on to other generations. So I'm not sure how to field the questions, but I'm happy to get Tamsin if you want to read out some of the questions or tap into some of the questions, or put anybody on who wants to ask a question. I'm happy to do that in the last 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, so if you have a question, feel free to either do the little Zoom raised hand thing or type your name or the question in the chat. We can either read that out, or you could just unmute yourself to ask the question. There is a question here from Stella, I think, asking how can we promote their well-being? Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, Barry?
Okay. Here in Australia, the Shed movement, the Australian Men's Sheds Association, is funded by the Australian Men's Health Policy. There's only 3 countries in the world which have got a men's health policy: Australia, Ireland, and Brazil. So my question back to, in talking about well-being, is given the acute issues of isolation, loneliness, and suicide in later life, including in many countries with population ageing like China and Japan and many countries in Europe, why aren't we doing something to address the needs of health and well-being? So my response is, I think that men's sheds are a health and wellbeing response, but if they were called men's health sheds, men wouldn't come. That's the irony of all of this. It works because the intended outcome is not named. It's just called a men's shed. And so while the underlying intent is health and well-being, it works because the intent is not named. People come because they want to be connected. But if you said, come to the shed because you're depressed or suicidal, people aren't going to come. So it's about doing it, creating the opportunity for people to connect, and in the process making people well as a consequence, not by foregrounding the health and wellbeing benefits. That's my response.
There's another question here that says, how important is it that the shed movement is or is not a gendered shared space? For example, is there any evidence of men disengaging or becoming more engaged if the space is gender shared? Good question. As with any community, if you go into a men's shed, there'll be some men in that shed who only want to be in the company of other men. There'll be some other men who will be totally relaxed and at home working shoulder to shoulder with women. I think it's a matter of acknowledging that many older men are facing issues of loneliness, isolation. Some are depressed, some are experiencing health issues, some might be experiencing issues with incontinence, some might be having issues with medical issues, with cancer. Some of those issues are difficult for men, particularly older men, to talk about and to share those experiences with women present. So I guess my answer is each shed has to negotiate how they make men feel at home or not. And so some sheds welcome women on an equal basis. Some sheds only welcome men. And that's my response. The community has to decide. It's not a top-down decision, and these decisions are discussed in the community and they're resolved by the community in ways that work for the men and women in that community. I'm not copying, it's not a cop-out on my base. It's about acknowledging that all communities are different
and we have to deal with these gender issues individually. But having said that, the national associations are very clear that all men and all women must be welcome.
There's another question here that says, what positive changes have you witnessed from a masculinity perspective from participating in the Med-Shed movement, i.e. a shift towards a type of male liberation?
I think that sheds bring together men from diverse backgrounds. So you've got ex-dentistry professors alongside painters, alongside ex-IV drug users, alongside people with a lifetime of mental illness. In the shed, none of them are labelled. They're all doing stuff together, shoulder to shoulder. And people's backgrounds, although people talk about their backgrounds and they'll share their stories and their backgrounds, they're not judged by their backgrounds, nor are they judged by what they can and can't do. And so the shed is a great leveller, where the men are making stuff together. I guess my answer is that it brings together men of diverse backgrounds and diverse approaches to masculinity. And I think in the process, it softens men and softens communities. And can I stress, when I first went into men's sheds, I expected in some of them to see maybe some alcohol. I expected maybe to see some sexist girly calendars. I haven't seen those things in men's sheds. Men who participate in men's sheds are broadly accommodating of women in their lives and in their communities. And they're certainly not sheds as organisations, and men in those communities are not misogynist. And so this is a really positive thing, I think. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was just about to ask that question. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to ask? Leave it just a moment so that we can see if there's anyone. If not, what I might do is just pass it off to Patricia to start wrapping things up.
You and before you, thank you to everybody for participating. If you want to know more, obviously read the book. But if you want to contact me, I'm also very happy to be contacted, and I will respond and answer as best I can.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's presentation. The presentation was really interesting. For me, it makes me learn about a different movement that's not really well known in my country. So thank you, Barry. If you check the chat, I share with you the link to our box store if you're interested, as well as a coupon code and you can get a 25% off with it. Thank you for attending. If you're registered at the Aging and Social Change Conference, I hope you have a good time these next days. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.